Natasha, this has been an incredible 9 months doing Grandpa and the Millennial. We started off focusing on sales and leadership. We kept that focus, but we changed the format a little to tell us your story. And we've had about 25 interviews with fantastic leaders, great conversations, and we learned so much. We wanted to take all of those principles, the things that we learned, our own experiences, and put together a 3-part series. And the 3-part series is really focused on the employee, your team, and overall performance. Have you had a good time?
Of course I've had a good time. The guests have been my absolute favorite. The more leaders we loop into a conversation, the better, the more the merrier. What I'm excited about is I think it's so important to really take a pause sometimes and think about what we've heard from each guest, what we've heard or said from our own perspective or experience, and start to really dial into key ideas and come out with some action items. So I think it's just a really good time. We've heard from so many great people. We've talked about a lot of ideas. Now, if we take a moment to really put some of that into action, I think is great.
And it's been fun. And it's been very rewarding. The conversations themselves have just inspired me. The feedback that we're getting from people who are listening, we didn't expect to have this many people listening, many people engaging with us. This has been very rewarding, more so than I thought. And I've really enjoyed this journey.
Welcome to Grandpa and the Millennial, the podcast for thought-provoking leadership conversations sparked from real-life leadership journeys. I'm here with Anthony, the Grandpa. I'm Natasha, the Millennial. And our mission is to help you, the professional leader or new entrepreneur, effectively influence, inspire, and develop both yourself and those you lead.
Over the next 3 episodes, we're going to talk about elevate. It's the key word. How do you elevate your people, your teams, your performance, everything and everyone around you? In this first episode, we're going to focus on the people. And the 3 things that we're going to talk about, the 3 takeaways that you're going to have from this episode, look for and identify the potential in your people. That's incredibly important as a leader, as you're looking at how you develop somebody. The second is meet them where they're at. And what does that mean? Where are they at in their journey? Are they in year 1 of their journey or they're year 5? The way you communicate, the way you develop, the way you engage is going to be incredibly different depending on where they're at. And it's up to you as a leader to understand and recognize, and then to meet them where they're at in their journey. And then equally important is how do you challenge them? And when I mean challenge, how do you challenge them to grow? It's what we all want to see, right? That's why we're in leadership. We want to see the people around us excel. And you have to have the toolkit to work with those people and challenge them and put them in spots and envision them in a spot that they didn't think was possible. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of Grandpa and the Millennial. Elevate. It's a simple word with a huge meaning. How do you elevate your employees, your peers, your teams, your performance, the people around you? How do you elevate yourself? There's the word elevate applies to so much, both professionally and personally. I'm really going to love this conversation.
And that's the goal, right? We talk about leadership. We talk about the journey, the influence, the impact we have on others. And that's exactly what we're trying to do, right? Is elevate, get people to the next stage, get ourselves to the next stage, whatever that might be. So I think that's the goal.
It is the goal. And it's been probably one of the favorite parts of doing this podcast with you and hearing everybody tell us about their stories. We're meeting with these incredible leaders, and the theme, there's a lot of themes that we've been taken away. But having your people as the center of what you're doing and helping them develop and elevating them has come out very, very clear. And so that's why we wanted to have this conversation today and the talk about how you do that with your employees and you impact performance. So I'm looking forward to this conversation with you.
Yeah, I think it's funny as we think back to conversations with our guests, one of the themes is when we ask about their mentors, they look back in hindsight and realize oh, they pivotal or instrumental in my growth, but they were doing these things at the time that the individual didn't realize was elevating them. And looking back, it's like, oh, that helped me grow. Or we look back and say, oh, I did help that person. So I think taking time to step back and be intentional with how you elevate people, identifying some of those things is what we can talk about. And, whoever's listening can take those action items and actually apply them in their day to day and be the leader that's molding people right now.
Yeah, and as you go through and we have this conversation, we've all worked with peers, or we've worked with bosses that have elevated us, and you can feel it, you can see it, it's tangible, and it's equally when you work with someone who's not going down that path. And I think it's everybody's responsibility that you can elevate your leaders as well. How do you manage up? How do you lead up?
I didn't know that was the thing, but now I know it's a thing. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's like often common. So
yeah, we're all equal. We all get up, we put our pants on, one leg at a time. We all have families and different activities that are pulling us in different motivations. So just because someone has a title above you clearly doesn't make them any better. But if you have the skills, you can elevate them as well. And we're not going to dive a lot into that, but taking these principles is really going to allow you to develop the people around you, and then your career as well, and engage with those leaders that may not be where you need them to be in your career.
That's what it is. I think any of the points that we talk about, or each of the guests, it's always, we're telling from a certain perspective, or they are, but you can really, if you take time and apply it in different areas, it doesn't matter who it is, right? Or whether it's a work team or your family or whatever it might be. So I think that's really where we start for today is, start with the individual. And then, there's other areas that you can lean into, but I think we should chat about how we elevate. We'll start it at the one, right? Look at your team or your team as individuals and, figure out how you can pour into how you start to elevate them.
Yeah, I agree. It's, focusing on the individual is probably the most important thing that you can do as a leader. You're going to have your teams, you're going to have your peers, you're going to have other leaders. But when you think about that individual who reports up into your organization, they are waking up in the morning, they're getting dressed, they're having their breakfast, they're going through their routine, and they're coming into work with the thought that they're going to give it everything they have to be the best version of themselves. And I always give people that benefit of the doubt. And it's up to us as leaders to make sure that we pour into them just as much as they're putting into themselves, if not more. And it can be a challenge. There's times where it always doesn't come easy, but understanding that there is a method and a process to doing that, that's repeatable. Is really what we want to get in today and over the next couple of conversations.
Yeah, because sometimes we don't realize it's a process, and it is. So I think so where do we start, right? Like if I want to elevate somebody, if I'm going into the office tomorrow or going in to coach my team, right? Whatever their situation is as a leader, where do you start? And I think it starts, and you can, obviously add, but I think it starts with looking and identifying the potential, right? Like you identify somebody, hey, I think I can elevate them. I think I can have an impact. It starts there. You can't take action until you at least identify something.
Yeah. And when I think back through my career, it's easy when you say, hey, let's look at this group of 25 people and identify who I can elevate. Well, when I was first starting out and I looked at the group, I didn't understand the different personality types. So I had somebody that may be, more boisterous and more engaged, and things that you may be attracted to that you don't even know, and you have bias. You're like, oh, that person I can elevate. But that's not the right method to go. There's a process. You can get in there. There's those people that are in the room, whether you call them an introvert or where they fall in that personality test, that are sitting back, they're observing, they're listening. And those might be some of your people that have the greatest potential, but you have to figure out how to find that out. So how do you find that out? How have you gone about that in the past?
Yeah, I think, I actually don't think that it's easy. When I look at teams, like as a leader, I have this natural, like, oh, I can make anybody better, right? Like, I know I'm going to put the effort in, I have the best intentions, like, I can make something, out of it. But as I've learned is, yes, there's ways you can lead certain people, but you aren't going to have the same impact. So when I think about actually looking at their potential, I think there's one, you have to be open, right? You have to challenge yourself, I think, creatively to think about that person in a situation outside of what they're in. So it's easy. Take a sales team. We're very familiar with sales teams, right? I can say, hey, they're a middle performer. I want to get them to a top performer, right? I want to get them to have X amount of more sales. That to me isn't necessarily elevating someone. Yes, that's, helping their performance, but just making them better at what they're doing. Yes, that's a little bit of elevation, but thinking in a way like, oh, they could be in a different position, right? What is their next career step? What's their next move? I think that's hard. And that's what takes some time to look and say, okay, what actually is the vision? Challenge yourself to say, can I see this person somewhere else? And then you talk about how you can get them there.
Yeah. And it's a situation where as you're making those assessments and you're looking and you start to develop this muscle, because you develop it over time. The longer you're in leadership role, you get better at this. You're not ever going to be perfect, so don't take that. But the muscle does develop. Seeing that vision and seeing the potential in somebody else, and then where they don't necessarily see it.
Oh, game changer.
Yeah. And equally that is that it may not be in the role, the position of the company where they're at today. And that's okay. It's more important for myself as a leader to develop somebody, help them see the vision and get them on the path that they're going to be happy and productive in their career versus being selfish and saying, they might be better off in operations, but I need them in sales. Or they might be an engineer and try and put them into the operations because I need that. Always focus on when you're looking and at that potential and that vision of what's best for that person. Lead with what's best for that person. And more times than not, you're going to win. You're going to win in that situation.
Yeah, you have to question it. And that's actually something that you've always said, like in our work together. It's been, whether it's me or somebody else is like, hey, we're developing you for your next role, right? And some people might be like, oh my, what does that mean? Take it in a negative way, but really it's elevating them to the next step. And whether that's with you or with your team or in their position or somewhere else, right? That's the goal. So I think that's the biggest thing is being able to see the vision, question your first, instinct or reaction, right? Sometimes we keep those, or at least I do. Like sometimes I don't think I'm being narrow-minded, but I am. And I'm thinking, oh yeah, okay, again, I can make the sales agent better. But what if I made the sales agent the manager, right? Or the sales agent the CEO? Like that is a different type of, I think, leadership is getting them to a completely different level. But if you can't be open to a vision that's not already there, I think you're going to struggle.
Yes. Now, you also have to recognize and realize over time, there are people that are not going to want to go to the next level, but it doesn't mean that you haven't helped them elevate. So they may stay in whatever position that they're in today for 5, 10, 15 years, be incredibly productive, very happy, and you can help them excel in that position. So it's not always about moving them up or moving them out. It's making sure that you're doing what's right by that person again and understanding where they're at. So as we're having this conversation, we've been talking for, a solid 10 minutes about all of these things that feel really good and they're abstract. So how do you do it? How do you go in and how do you see that potential? How do you apply it? How do you start to apply some tools to making this happen?
So I think that it might sound a little bit like simple, I guess, but it's true. And I think that we actually don't do it enough. So I think if there was an actionable item that we're talking about looking and finding potential is to really go through, right? Whatever individuals you have, whether it's 1, whether it's 100, whether it's 20, right? If you're going in to, again, your office or your team, if you take a look across your your team, your roster, whatever it might be, and really start to look at who you can envision somewhere else. So, maybe it's literally writing down their strengths and weaknesses or taking note of it. That's one method. Or you can look at, imagine them in another seat. Imagine if something happened on your team, if you were forced to make moves, because sometimes we're forced into something all of a sudden, right? We get really creative and we make things happen. So I think taking stock of their strengths and weaknesses and then imagining them, if you had to put them somewhere else, where would you put them? And you're probably going to do that based on the things that you know about them, right? Like, oh, this person might fit better in marketing because they're really creative. So just in a way, just start to envision them somewhere else outside of what they're doing, or maybe it's in with what they're doing. But I think that exercise of actually forcing yourself would be helpful.
Yeah, I think the important takeaway for this part of the conversation is you have to identify and recognize the strengths and weaknesses, and you have to write them down. Mm-hmm. So as we've gone through these podcasts, we've had conversations and we've seen what drives success. Writing down your goals is one of the most important steps in getting to where you want to be. And doing that with the people that you're leading is critical. You have to write down what their strengths are so that you can start to foster the strengths and then develop or work on the opportunities where the weaknesses are. So, and once you start to do that, the conversations that you're having with those people and where you start to envision them and where you start to see them progress will change significantly. And when I was young in my career, I didn't write that down. I was like, oh yeah, he, she, whoever I was working with, they're good at this. And then I come back in a month and I was like, oh, did I foster that? Did I work into it? What did I have? So writing it down is so critically important in this spot.
It's the exercise of doing it, right? Like, yes, writing it down, but forcing yourself to think and not just think in a way that is what they're doing. Like, I can't say it enough, is because I didn't do this. Like when I was, coming up, it was very like I had my team, we had our goal, right? It's a sales team. Sales is our goal. So it was very like, what is their potential within sales? So to just sit down and be like, oh, this person is really good at making people laugh, right? Like, or this person is really good at articulating an idea. Like, they're little things like that, whether it's a characteristic of a person or it's an actual task that they're good at, like that's a strength. Or weakness is, hey, they feel uncomfortable in speaking situations, or they aren't as good at overcoming objections. Like, there's so many different ways. And if you force yourself, sometimes I do it and I'm like, okay, you have to get 15. And it's like, man, 15 strengths from somebody, and you're like forcing yourself. You get real creative after like 0.6 because you're like stretching. You have to stretch your mind. So I think that's it's just a big one. It's an exercise of putting it, and not that we're there yet, but all of what we're talking about is before you're even telling the person, right? Like, I'm going to go through my team and I'm going to find out who I think has potential and who can do this, right? I'm creating the vision. When I go and like knock on that door and tell that person, hey, I think you're going to be the next CEO, they're gonna be like, what? And I'm like, I could already start to see it. And that's where we start to, move into the journey. So I think you have to know that, because the big thing you said earlier is believing in them before they believe in themselves. That was huge for like absolute game changer for me, was like somebody thinking like, oh, you could do this. And then I started thinking like, oh, could I do that? And I'm like, now I'm doing it.
Yeah. And, there was a time in my career when one of my mentors had talked to me about writing down, whether it was a goal or writing down the strengths and the weaknesses of my employees and documenting, have it in the file. I've been around for a while, so had a paper file and you actually had to write it down
or something.
And I was like, you're out of your mind. Like, that's too much effort. And as I started to put that effort in, I started to realize, and now as I look across leaders, it's the difference between an average leader and potentially a great leader. And I, in your mind's eye right now, I want you to think about if you walked into your boss's office and said, can I see the file on me? And you pulled it up and you saw what they had as their strengths and the way that they saw you and what their weaknesses are. And we'll get to, the conversation should be happening. But if you walked into my office and you saw how I thought your strengths were, the amount of encouragement and empowerment that would give you that's a game changer. So for those that are listening and saying, oh, that's too much work, it's okay. But if you want to be great, this is one of the most important steps as a leader that I would recommend taking as soon as possible. And if you want to be average, that's okay as well.
I just say be careful you keep that weakness list though, because if I saw that, I'd be like, oh, that one might hurt a little. You might have to like talk me through it. But
that's a great point. So if you saw that list in the beginning, as you're doing these assessments and trying to figure out potential, obviously in the beginning, you're going to be sensitive. But if I've had an employee that's worked with me for any amount of time, if they see the list that I have, that should not come as a surprise. We should be working on that, which we're going to transition into the journey.
Good point.
That there should be no surprises there. It's the old saying, if you come to your review and you're surprised, I didn't do my job.
It's very, very true. Yes, very true. Okay, so we're elevating people, right? You're starting with finding the potential. Look for it, envision it, take note of the strengths and weaknesses because you have to know where you're going. Once you have an idea of where you're going, I think that takes us into the next step of meeting them where they're at. Right? You have this vision. And like I said, you're going to go, knock on the door. You're going to sit, have a conversation with them. Like, hey, I see this. And this is, now all of a sudden there's two people in on this journey that you're about to take together to elevate them.
Yeah. And meeting them where they're at is so incredibly important. So I've been in leadership going over 30 years and I started in the Marine Corps. I've been in health insurance for 25 years. And that first year that I was in insurance, if you came and talked to me the way that you did when you've been in your 20th year, you're going to lose me. I'm not there yet. I'm not in that. That's where you're at in your journey. Mm-hmm. You need to meet that person if they're in year 1, 2, 3, and 4. And everybody who's in year 1 is going to be at a different place in their journey. People learn, quicker. Some people take longer to develop. It's up to us as leaders to understand where they're at, to challenge them, which we'll get to. But you don't overwhelm somebody with all of your knowledge just because you've been doing something for a long time. You have to meet them where they're at. You need to give it to them in chunks that they can digest, that they can apply, and really start to focus on developing, again, coming back to their strengths, and focusing in on their weaknesses as well.
It's funny. It's how we coach our sales call, right? Your customer, don't just give them everything like they've been doing insurance for 10 years like you have, right? Meet the customer where they're at, right? Meet your person where they're at. I think it's true. I think it's, and that's where the journey comes in. I didn't realize, it's funny when you say in your year 1, we've talked about this on the podcast with a couple people about things being a moment or a season, and you don't really know that it's a season or a moment until it's over. So now as a leader, I look back and I'm like, oh yeah, typical year 1 leader, right? This is, oh, that's funny. Or, oh, you start to see other people doing the same thing you were doing 5 years ago. And you're like, oh my gosh, I can help. I was there. And that's when you start to find, I think, identifiable places or ideas or things that you can start to help them with. And that's where it becomes the journey. I think if you identify somebody's potential and you're like, okay, again, I'm going to take them from their place right now and, help them get to wherever the right seat on the bus is, right? You don't know what that's exactly going to look like. Yes, it's a process of, we just said that, right? Is you look back and you're like, oh, I can kind of see where they're at, but the journey's different. You're going to be on it with them. You're going to have to engage with them and start to pull in okay, I see this in you. I believe in it. I need you to believe in it. Takes us back to what we've talked about, the why, things like that. So I think this is where it starts to really get into engaging with somebody so that they start to see it as well. Because once you both see it, then you can start to take action.
Yeah. And the environment that you create for that person, and we'll get to teams later, but for that person is incredibly important. Oh, yeah. One of the philosophies that, I've really had roots in my foundation as a leader is that there is no mistake that you're going to make that I can't fix. And it's anytime I have a new employee, I have a new leader, and whether it's at work or even outside of work. It's a philosophy I go by. And it took me a while to get there. And the reason is because when I was a first year leader and I had someone come in and they made a mistake that I had made, multiple times, or I made in the years past, or I've seen other people make, I was so eager to tell them that I had the solution for them. And I looked like I was talking down to them. Like, oh, you made that mistake. This is what you should have done. And my intent was well, but I was embarrassing them. I was putting them in a position like, oh, you didn't have to tell me that. So now I have that conversation up front. I create the environment where go ahead, make the mistake. Now, if people make $1 million mistake, if you're working in that kind of business, I hope that you have safeguards so that doesn't happen. But when it does, I would challenge you as a leader to this point. And I think it was Steve Jobs who said this.
It was in my head. I was like, if he doesn't quote him, I'm quoting him.
I think it was Steve Jobs who said, why would I fire someone who made $1 million mistake? I just invested $1 million in them and they're never going to make that mistake again. Yeah. And I took that philosophy to heart. So I think from me, that's the foundation in going into that journey, is creating that safe spot for that person to start to develop and start to grow and create that rapport with them. So as you're starting off with your people, how are you doing it? What are your steps?
Yeah, I'm super reflective. So I think take it from when I was in the position, right? Like, what kind of leader did I need? They have that saying is like, be the leader that you needed at the time. So early when I'm trying to figure out my own potential and I'm coming up and I don't know, what I'll be good at. And I might have been not the most confident, don't get me wrong, but, maybe not the most. And I think about how I was approached in a situation like that. I've literally had leaders that were like, hey, you could be really good at this other position. And I asked straight up, I'm like, why would you think that? Like, why would you even put me up against these two people? Like, why would I even be in the conversation? Because I couldn't see it. Like, I just didn't. It was my gut instinct, or not my gut, but my first instinct was like, why? Like, what are you seeing? Because I didn't see it. And then backing that with the conversations, like you just said, is, hey, there's like, I'm in it with you, right? I'll have your back. You make a mistake. It started thinking like, okay, I could give it a try. And then I can, even if I'm not great, or if I don't do it right the first time, that's where I'm at. So it resonates with me because I literally went through it. So then when I'm looking again, I'm trying to be the leader that I needed at the time. So sitting with them, giving them a little bit of their vision, really playing up those strengths that I've identified as, hey, you're really good at this. And I've done it before. I've said, hey, I think you could really be, the next supervisor. And I've had people say, I don't think so. And I'm like, what are you talking? And I'm so excited because I'm like, oh my gosh, like this next leader, I could see it. And they're like, no, I don't, and I'm like, wait, what? And so then you get into this conversation and start to play into that. It's like, well, you don't realize that every day the mood changes when you walk in the office and you say good morning to people. Or you don't know that your name comes up in one-on-ones I have with other people because you're a go-to for things like that. And then all of a sudden the conversation changes, right? That person now is like, oh, well, maybe I do see it. They believe in me. They're going to have my back if I don't do well. It just creates this whole entire environment or ecosystem where you can start to test the waters like on that potential, I think.
Yeah. And having a leader who sees the vision, has the vision to see your potential is incredible. It comes back to the strengths and weaknesses, right? Mm-hmm. That was the foundation. And then starting to have those conversations as you're bringing them along the journey, as they're going through, they're developing their strengths. They're making mistakes. You're there to support them to get through that. And maybe mistakes might be a strong word, but they're developing their skill set. But then, really focusing in on that employee themselves and how you encourage them to grow, how you give them value, how you show them appreciation. Again, it's the differentiator between what a good leader is or an average leader and what a great leader is. And so I want to spend a few minutes just talking about some of those things on how you make somebody feel valuable, and how you show appreciation. So what are some of the ways that you do that?
Good question. For me, I think it's really important to do the small things. So I think sometimes people expect like, oh yeah, if I'm a top performer, right, I get the kudos. But for me, it's those little thank yous and the actual, I guess, the context behind it. Like, I really think it's important. Like, you'll shoot an email to somebody. I'm not standing up on the floor and saying it in front of I mean, there's time for that, but getting an email, for example, that you're not expecting of like, hey, I really appreciated this. You're always good at this. Like, here's, got really good, feedback on you. When it's almost like you're going out of your way, but I don't think it's out of your way as a leader. I think it's something that you should do, but sometimes people don't expect that. And so I think giving them the little things, the positive reinforcements behind like, hey, call it out when they're doing something good. And it doesn't have to be in this like theatrical way, but it's like, wow, you really had an impact. Like, do you realize that you just helped your teammate make their monthly goal? And sometimes they don't. They think like, oh, it's just, part of my job. So I think celebrating the small wins, calling out, being vocal and honest and authentic with what you're appreciative of, because trust me, there's all those people that, you have other things to worry about with them. But I think that's one of the things that I try to be very mindful and the little things all of the time to make them feel what I'm doing is important and it's noticed and it's recognized and it's appreciated.
Yeah. And there's whole books written on, how you appreciate people. So we're not recreating anything new, but things that we've seen work, the little things and focusing on that recognition within the team is absolutely important. COVID has changed things. We're not in the office as much. There's not as many, events. Don't typically see families of employees in a lot of the environments today. So how do you show that appreciation that you may have had at a company party where you were able to meet their spouse or their kids and tell them how incredible that person is? You write their family a letter and you tell them how great they are and the things that they've done. And you take note of that throughout the year. That's a big one. That takes time and effort, but the impression that it makes and what it do is incredibly important. And so as we talk about, these things that we do for appreciation, those are what we're doing. But there's other ways of bringing them in and asking their opinion and then taking their opinion and their ideas and applying them to processes. We are one big puzzle piece. The greatest teams are one big puzzle. We're a piece, as are our employees. And when they come to you with an idea and a thought, you need to take that. And it's not always going to work, but apply it and make sure that people know, say, listen, we're going to put this into play. We've heard you. We've heard your feedback, and we're going to implement this. And then give them credit. You want to make sure they give them credit. That starts to build. You're giving people kudos, you're bringing them in, and you're listening to them. They know that they have a safe environment and that they are contributing to the overall success of not just their performance, but their peers in the team. It's incredibly important piece of what we do.
That's very true. And I thinking back to all of our guests and like certain things that they've said. And I think it was maybe John and or Casey Camacho that talked about purpose, right? People want to feel like they have a purpose in what they're doing. We spend 40 plus hours a week at our jobs. And if you're not doing something that you feel valued in, that you find meaningful, that you think is important, not to say that it's, I get part of it is like your job, right? But to feel that and to understand that makes them just more invested in themselves and you as a leader in the team. So it's just an absolute snowball effect.
Yeah. And those are all the feel goods. That's easy, right? So it takes a little bit of effort. It's easy to tell somebody how good they are. But for me, what's important, and it's important for other people, I want you to sit down with me and I want you to tell me how I get better in my areas of weakness. I want to have those difficult conversations that say, if you want to be in this position in 2 years, you're going to need to go and study this in the marketplace. You're going to need to have better conversations cross-functionally. You're going to need to pull back on some of, maybe your arrogance or the way that you joke. Those aren't always easy conversations, but they've been some of the most meaningful conversations in my career. And when I look at the mentors that have had those with me and we've focused in and we've developed that, has by far helped me in my journey, which is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And when I've had those conversations, some of them I've failed miserably. Like, oh my gosh, I've gone home and said, oh my, I've ruined their weekend. It wasn't my intent.
Yeah.
And over time, I've gotten better. It's never perfect, but I've gotten the feedback as well. Thank you. Thank you for letting me know this was a blind spot and helping me develop it. My weakness is now my strength, and I'm more rounded. And when you can do that, it's very fulfilling.
Yeah, it starts to elevate them, which is exactly what, to get them to a different position. So as and position can be, obviously many things, not literal position, but if we're meeting them, so we've identified, right? Like we're saying, hey, I see their potential, meeting them where they're at, understanding where they are and where they have to go. So what are some of the ways, like you just said, those conversations? So how conversations of what needs to be involved, but how do you, what are some action items, meeting them where at this part of elevating them? Like what are some things that you should do to give those messages or get that across?
Yeah. So we talked about documenting the strengths and the weaknesses. So most important is having those, whether it's weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly one-on-ones, and giving the feedback and documenting that feedback. And anytime you say that, it's like, that's easy. I can take the time to do that. No. It's not easy. You have to put that time out. You have to sit down. You have to spend time to make sure that you understand. So saying that you had a one-on-one and checking that box, average leader, going through and being intentional and being consistent is what makes a great leader. So put the time in before, document it, and then it is by far the most important, which is consistency. If you have a one-on-one schedule with someone weekly, you better show up to them weekly. Every once in a while, you're going to have one, but I've had people call me out. And they're like, why do you put this on my calendar? You don't even meet with me. I failed there in my career, and I've recognized it. So
we get busy, but it's an excuse, right? They say if it's important to you, you'll make it a priority, right? And I think that we have to keep it true because it's not easy. Our schedules get busy. There's new things every single day. We start to react, right? Everything start to get fires and you have to start to prioritize. And so I think it's important to keep that up. And like you said, the consistency as far as their development, they're going to come in and say, hey, you saw this potential in me, or this is where we started, right? And we talked about where I could possibly be better or where I'm really good now and could still get better. But I think having that and diving in and pouring into those ideas over time is also going to help them realize like, okay, I am making progress, right? It's not just a conversation. You didn't just call it out because it, felt good or you had one good day, but every single week. And then incorporating into that, not just the, hey, here's all the good things. Here's some of the tougher things. Here's the weaknesses that we need to make some adjustments on. That's what's really going to help them. And in my leadership, like absolutely not easy. It's a lot, right? It takes a lot as a leader. That's where I think most energy goes to, is you're pouring into other people constantly. And it takes a lot of effort. And of course, the result is you're trying to make them better, but it's fully an effort. It can't just be a box that you have to check.
Yeah. You have to remember, or I think you should remember, when that person gets up and they're coming in and they look at their calendar and they realize they have a one-on-one from the week before, whether it's a week, bi-weekly, or monthly, they've put effort into the conversation that you had and they are excited to talk to you. And those are the best leaders, where your employees are like, I cannot wait to tell them that I applied those principles that we talked about. And, I was able to get X amount more production. I got a sale. I influenced this person's life. And when you miss that meeting or you cancel that meeting, you are sending a direct message, and it is felt. So consistency and making sure that when you put something on the calendar, you're there for your people, incredibly important.
Yeah. And I think just building on those topics too. So in those conversations, right, make sure that you're talking about what's important. Make sure you are tracking that progress. Make sure that you are pouring into what you set out to do to begin with, on top of checking in with them, right? Like tying things, making sure, because all of that starts to become with motivation and come with, accomplishment and areas of opportunity and all of that good stuff. So I think definitely we've like document the strengths, right? Meet on it consistently, work on it. And then I really want to get to this part of the conversation. I think the next step, and I'm interested to hear some of your feedback on it, is starting to position them or challenge them, right? We've identified this person as, hey, they have potential. Now we've met with them and we're working on some of those areas of strength. But how do I start to challenge and position them and start to give them action items that can really push them or help them to the next level?
Yeah. Every part of this is my favorite. So it's really hard. But so when I think about that, and depending on, we've met them where they're at in their career, we're developing those strengths. We're starting to see the potential. We're having conversations. We understand their why. All of these different things are coming together. And there's a lot of different ways you can do this. A simple way, you could take a team meeting and say, hey, I want you to present this slide today and talk about how you apply your principles to this performance and how you get these results. That's one way. You're going to have some people that thrive in that, and you're going to have some people that's just not their thing. I work with someone who just does not want to present. One of my top performers, but understanding where those limits are and pushing those. I mean, sometimes 2 or 3 times to say, let's try it again. Maybe you needed a little bit more practice. So that's a way of that. So what are some of the ways that you do it? And there's a lot of different ways, but what are some of the ways that you do it?
Yeah, I think I guess this isn't a way, but I guess a theme that you want to keep in the back of your mind is it's not easy being a leader. Like all of this is working on somebody's potential and trying to elevate them is literally taking them to a place where they haven't been before. So the standards, like you have to challenge them. You have to be putting them in uncomfortable situations. You have to be working towards something that they might not see yet. And that's going to be hard, right? They're going to be like, oh my gosh, like I've had times where I've just straight up been like mad or irritated, and I come through and I'm like, oh my gosh, okay, that presentation was good for me, just being pushed so much that like I get in those positions where I'm a little defensive or something. And it's because I've had people see like, oh, she could do this, and they're right. Like I just needed to push through. Like it's okay for it to be hard, right? And so everything that we're doing, you're going to deliberately put people in positions that are going to be uncomfortable, and they might not be, fully great at it, but I think that's the one thing. So like you said, is identify, I think starting small, right? A task. Maybe it's asking them to answer, hey, can I ask you, I used to do this to really get them just like lightly started, is in a team meeting, right? Hey, I'll prep you beforehand. I'd sometimes give them a heads up, like, hey, we're going to talk about this theme today. If I can call on you and you give like 1 or 2 things, right? Putting him, okay, I need to think outside of just my daily tasks. She's asking me about a sales concept that I need to go, get a little bit outside my bubble. And now I'm going to tell all my peers about it. If it's you touched on the presentation, if it's, maybe getting a one-on-one with somebody, that's been something that's happened to me. And I realized like, oh, this is pretty good, right? Like, hey, you should go to lunch with this person. And I'm like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Like,
seems so out there.
It's so funny when I say it now, I laugh because I'm like, oh my God, girl, go to lunch, like it's not a big deal. But at the time, it's uncomfortable, and it's somebody that, could be in a position that's outside of your team, or just to give you different perspectives. So I think it's really important to look for little opportunities, and not all leaders do that. There are leaders who do not specifically look like, how do I say this? So there are leaders that want you to do things to get the job done, right? And then there are average leader, we'll call. The great leader, the exceptional leader is like, hey, I could do this presentation, but I'm going to go ahead and let him or her do it because I'm going to let them, have a moment, whatever it is. Like to be deliberate and put people in positions that are to help them grow, and you just kind of sit back and like watch them and support them. I think it's huge. Like I did not used to do that, and I've really been trying to be mindful about finding ways.
Yeah, the absolute greatest leaders are not worried about getting the credit, and it sounds like, oh, wow, that leader is doing all of the right things. They're putting their people in a position to do presentation and take all of the credit. And I'd be lying if I didn't say that it's not the most fulfilling part of the job is to see other people succeed. And I am getting just as much out of putting that person in a position to succeed. The rapport that we're building, the relationship, the performance that is coming out of giving someone else credit is immeasurable. It's more than I would ever get by doing the presentation on my own. Message might be exactly the same, but that bond that I have with that person is completely different. And when my leaders do that for me and put me in that position, the loyalty that I have to them and what I'm willing to do the next day, the next week, I can't even describe. Like they've empowered me, which is such a very important piece.
Oh yeah, as we grow, it's so funny. As I always love to look back and think like, oh yeah, that was my, early years of leadership. I look back and at the time, I might have had 5 meetings with my leader ahead of this presentation that I was giving to, their boss. And so I'm thinking like, oh my gosh, like this is my presentation, right? I'm owning it, like all this stuff. In the background, everyone might not know that like, oh, hey, my leader did this whole thing with me. In hindsight, I'm like, okay, everyone knew, but but at the time you feel like, oh my gosh, it's like, I don't have kids, but I think, it was a kid once, but you give them like a little bit of extra, like, they just do something and then they feel like, oh my gosh, like, I guess use the word empowered. Like that is so much more meaningful. And now all of a sudden you think that they believed in their potential then, put them in a position where they do something outside of their comfort zone, that feeling right after it being really hard or really uncomfortable. They're like, oh my gosh, I'm better. Like my next presentation is going to be better because I just did good at that one. The next one's going to be great. That type of mindset is where you start to elevate people. All of a sudden they start to elevate themselves even more. It's like you get it started, right? Whatever that saying is, needs a spark or something. And then all of a sudden there's the flame. But I think that's the big one. And I have to quote this because it was from one of our previous guests, Shannon. And I think he really summed it up. So he said, talking about the team, right? You challenge them, you give them some opportunities, you stretch them, and then you find out. Because sometimes it's not always going to go, right? You push and you're like, oh, I want this to be great. And they might not do great. Like that's just what it is, right? You might need to go back to the drawing board and pivot, or you can pour into somebody that does not like to do presentations and you think, oh, we could get them there, right? And then you find like, no, we can't. So, or it's just not for them. So not that you can't, but maybe they just don't want to, or it's not just their wheelhouse. So you pivot. And so I think that was just so simple, but it's true. Like you have to be willing to if you're going to let them do it, and then support them in the background. Wow, I really got on my soapbox there.
I love it. Simple but profound. And so as leaders, this is equally important. So when you are in great organizations, a lot of the times that someone is being developed, that they're going through a presentation, maybe their first or their 5th time, or it's a new subject, and people are supportive. They're not calling them out, in that moment, or even within their development process. Us as leaders in that great organization, if you're my peer and I see you call someone out in front of that is, just petty, I'm going to have a conversation with you and say, Natasha, that we're developing these people. That number wasn't that important. You can come back to me. Let me go develop that person. Don't challenge them in front of people. Those are the average leaders. And those are not the people that you want to put within your team or you want to surround yourself with, because they're not going to allow other people to feel safe. Now, you're going to have young people, young leaders that make that mistake because they're early in their career, and you just have to have a conversation with them. But the greatest leaders are always going to see, this person has potential. Their leader is putting them in a position to succeed. Let me help them. Let me encourage them, and let me be part of that spark. And I've seen it time and time again because I've been around for so long. I'm a dinosaur, but I've seen some of those people grow into some of the greatest leaders in organizations. It's incredible to be part of, even if you're just watching it and you're watching another leader develop them.
Yeah, and it goes the other way too. As people start to pick up, it's not like your teams and things don't talk about, like, they're stack ranking you as a leader, I think, against others. But like, oh, you're whatever to their peer, like, oh, your leader is better than my leader, whatever. Sometimes they're all great, sometimes they're not. But I think not just watching other people develop their people is really cool, but as you start to realize, and I've watched leaders up, and I'm like, okay, this is, you try and take from different angles, right? Again, there's strengths and weaknesses. To the point earlier, is sometimes you're developing up, or managing, coaching up, is you start to see those leaders and start to recognize, and that starts to become, I think, your reputation is not just in an instance where one person doesn't feel comfortable, but all of a sudden, in that example, you call somebody out, like, other people are watching you too, and then it becomes you just start to realize what leaders are developing and pouring into people, and what other leaders might just be, average or more managing it. So I think it's interesting to watch down to the side and up.
It is interesting. And I love these conversations. I could spend, and we're going to spend a few hours after this, but I hope that we're giving people insight and valuable information. We had some key pieces we wanted to talk about on an employee today. And for those people that are listening in and saying, okay, how do I be a great leader? And how do I manage? This would have been valuable to me. And I hope people are taking value out of this. And I hope that you apply these principles. I want you to go back through the key learnings, so people walk away with them. But thank you for this conversation. It's one of my favorite.
Yeah. It's always food. I take it as food for thought, right? Even if it's just one or two things. So do with it what you want, but I have seen this work. I know you've seen it work. We've had many conversations outside of just this. These ideas and principles, right, didn't just come out of thin air. We've seen it work. So take the time. If you're listening tomorrow, next week, whatever it is, the things that we went over, a couple action items that will challenge you to do is, one, look for the potential in your team. Take note, write down, take documentation of their strengths and their weaknesses. Imagine those people in elevated situations, just openly, creatively, take time to do that. Next, meet them where they're at, right? If you identify that, go and look and have a conversation, engage with that person, have the meetings, be consistent, pour into those strengths and start to develop them. And then lastly, challenge them. Look for one thing. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to have a year's roadmap worth of things. Look for one thing over the next 1 month that you can give this person to do that's a little outside of their comfort zone, that might be a little challenging, and push them a little bit. And that's really going to test the potential and move them forward.
Yeah. And this is the beginning of our conversation. So please, apply these principles. We get a lot of messages, especially after our episodes air.
I love it.
I absolutely love the messages. Give us your feedback. Tell us how it works, or give us your input. What would you like to hear about? What would you like to talk about? Especially on LinkedIn. Tell us your story. We post the leadership principles. We have a theme each week. Give your input. This is where we're going to, from our own experiences, but from your feedback as well. And then your private messages of saying, hey, this is what I'd like to hear. This is who I'd like to see. So that's how we got to this 3-part series. And I appreciate the conversation today. And I look forward to the next 2 weeks and what we'll be talking about. Next week will be team.
Yeah, exactly. I was just going to say, be on the journey with us. So take it right now. This episode was about individuals. That's where we start, right? Next one, we're going into teams. So start to work. It's where it starts. Like, start with one and then you can go to many. So looking forward to the next couple as well. We'll have great tidbits. Would love to hear from you. Give us your feedback, all of that good stuff.
All right, Natasha, do your thing.
Close this out. All right. Gramps the Millennial out.